I always thought I knew my husband completely. Graham and I had been together for over a decade, building what I believed was a strong, loving marriage. But one morning, everything changed. I opened my email and saw a notification from our bank about a huge transfer, millions of dollars moving out of our joint account. My heart skipped. I hadn't approved it, and Graham hadn't mentioned anything. For months, I had noticed small signs. He was working late more often, locking drawers I had never noticed before, and taking calls in private. He told me it was just stress from work, but a nagging feeling in my chest told me something was off. I tried to brush it aside at first, telling myself I was imagining things. But seeing that transfer notice made it impossible to ignore. I spent the day thinking back on the past several months, piecing together little moments that didn't fit. The sudden secrecy, the small lies that didn't matter on their own but now seemed connected, the way he avoided answering questions about our finances. It all pointed to a hidden plan. My stomach churned as I realized that the life I thought we were sharing might have only been an illusion. Instead of confronting him right away, I decided to observe quietly. I needed to understand the full picture before making any move. I checked our accounts carefully, cross-referencing transactions and emails, noticing patterns I had missed before. Every small clue made my suspicion grow stronger. The man I loved and trusted wasn't just stressed. He was building something without me, using my name and our shared assets. It was a strange mix of fear and clarity. I felt betrayed, yes, but also oddly focused. I knew I had to stay calm and smart. This wasn't just about money. It was about control, trust, and the life we had promised each other. I realized that if I reacted in anger, I might lose the upper hand. Instead, I needed to understand exactly what he was doing, step by step. That day changed everything. I couldn't pretend anymore that our marriage was as it seemed. What I had thought was love and partnership was now a puzzle I had to solve carefully. And as I started digging deeper, I felt a mix of resolve and determination. I couldn't let him take everything we had built, not without knowing the full story and preparing to act. The first seeds of a plan began to form in my mind, quiet but firm. By evening, I sat at my desk, staring at the bank statements and emails, realizing the truth. The man I trusted more than anyone had been hiding his intentions from me all along. The foundation of our life together was cracking, and it was up to me to decide how I would respond. That moment marked the beginning of uncovering everything he had tried to keep secret, and I knew I had to be ready for whatever came next. I had been searching Graham's home office for my misplaced passport when something caught my eye. A plain manila folder tucked behind some files was labeled Property Settlement Draft. Curiosity made me reach for it, but when I opened it, my hands froze. Inside were divorce papers, my name on every page, already prepared, dated 6 months ago. He had been planning this in secret, lining up lawyers without ever telling me a word. My chest tightened as I stared at the documents. Shock, disbelief, and anger churned inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew confronting him without understanding the full picture could backfire. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of every page, every note, every signature. I needed evidence before anything else. After that, I reached out to Mara Jennings, an old friend who had become a private investigator. Mara had experience in corporate investigations, tracing hidden finances and uncovering secret dealings. I explained what I had found and handed her the photos. Mara listened carefully, asking questions I hadn't even thought to consider. Together, we began to piece together a hidden side of Graham's life. I felt a mix of fear and determination. Every file we uncovered, every small clue we followed, revealed a man I barely knew. The divorce papers were just the start. There had to be more. I realized I was no longer just a wife caught off guard. I was now a strategist, observing, collecting, and preparing. Days passed in a blur of calls, emails, and quiet research. Mara traced financial moves, cross-referenced legal filings, and dug into records Graham thought he had hidden. I watched, learning details about my husband I had never imagined. It was painful, but knowing the truth gave me power. Each secret uncovered was a piece of a larger puzzle, and the picture that emerged was both shocking and enlightening. Through it all, I stayed outwardly composed whenever I was around Graham. I laughed at his jokes, asked about his day, and kept up appearances. Inside, however, my mind raced, cataloging everything I learned. I realized I couldn't let emotions take control. I had to stay methodical. Each move Mara and I made was carefully planned to ensure I would be ready for whatever Graham tried next. By the end of the week, I had a clear sense of the scale of his deception. The divorce papers were a signal of the life he had secretly built without me, but they were also an entry point to uncovering much more. With Mara's help, I felt a quiet, growing confidence. I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing, and every step brought me closer to understanding the truth and reclaiming control over my life. I couldn't believe what Mara had found. She showed me a series of transactions linking Graham to shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Belize. Each transfer was small enough to seem normal, but when I added them up, it was hundreds of millions of dollars moving out of our joint investments. My stomach turned as I realized he had been secretly taking money I had every right to access. He wasn't just hiding things, he was building a fortune on the side, and I had been completely unaware. I felt a mix of anger and clarity. Fear was gone. For the first time, I wasn't panicked. I was sharp, focused, and ready to fight. I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I needed someone who understood the complicated world of finance and could protect what was legally mine. That's when I called Daniel Rourke, a financial attorney with a strong reputation for discretion. I explained the situation, and he immediately understood the stakes. Together, we started planning how to secure my share of the assets without alerting Graham. I didn't want him to suspect I knew the full extent of his scheme. Every step had to be careful, precise, and invisible. I learned to read the patterns of his transfers, to notice which accounts he touched, and to make sure my own holdings were untouchable. Mara continued to dig, giving me evidence and insight that helped me map out his secret world. The more I uncovered, the more I felt my confidence grow. I wasn't just protecting money, I was reclaiming control over my life. Graham had thought he could outsmart me, but now I had knowledge he couldn't even imagine. Every detail I gathered was a piece of a bigger puzzle, and I was putting it together carefully. I learned the names of his companies, the accounts he used, and even the ways he tried to cover his tracks. Anger fueled me, but I kept it under control. I knew I couldn't let it cloud my judgment. Every move I made had to be calculated. I began to see a pattern, a rhythm to his actions, and I started planning my next steps. For the first time, I felt in command, like I was finally matching him at his own game. By the end of the week, I had secured my side of the assets quietly, without him noticing a thing. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had no idea how far ahead I was. The shock and betrayal were still there, but they were tempered by strategy and determination. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry, focused, and ready to see this through to the end. I realized I could outsmart him, one step at a time, and finally take back what was mine. Every day around Graham, I acted like nothing had changed. I smiled at his jokes, laughed when he expected me to, kissed him goodnight, and planned dinners as if our marriage were perfect. I let him think I was oblivious, that I trusted him completely. No one could know the truth, not yet. Behind closed doors, I worked quietly. I recorded conversations without him noticing, saving every word that could prove his lies. I copied documents, organized emails, and kept meticulous notes of every detail he thought was hidden. I even started replicating some of his shell companies under my own trusts, making sure that if he tried to move more money, I would be ready. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. During one candlelit dinner, Graham talked about work in his usual polished way, spinning stories that were mostly lies. I listened carefully, watching his eyes, his hands, and the little tells he couldn't control. Every twitch, every hesitation, every overexplained point became part of my record. I wasn't just listening, I was learning how he thought, how he tried to deceive people, how he believed he could outsmart everyone. At the same time, I made sure to never show anger or suspicion. I wanted him to believe I was still the loving wife he had married, someone who would never suspect a thing. Every smile, every affectionate gesture, every casual conversation was part of the mask I wore. I let him lower his guard completely, even as I prepared to take back everything he tried to steal. The work was exhausting but satisfying. Each night, I backed up the new files, checked that my recordings were clear, and made notes about patterns I was seeing in his behavior. The more I observed, the more confident I became. I realized that his scheme wasn't perfect, that every lie had cracks, and that I could exploit those cracks to protect myself and my assets. By the time I went to bed, I felt a strange combination of exhaustion and exhilaration. I was pretending to be the perfect wife, but in reality, I was building my defense layer by layer. I wasn't just reacting to his actions anymore. I was planning the steps that would allow me to turn the tables completely. I knew I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. One wrong move could ruin everything I had worked for. But for the first time in months, I felt in control. I was no longer the wife being deceived. I was the one watching, recording, and learning. I was ready to take everything Graham had thought was untouchable and use it against him, piece by piece. Mara finally captured something I had suspected, but couldn't prove. She had photos of Graham with another woman, Tessa Moran, a young art curator from Dallas. It wasn't just casual meetings. He had been funding her gallery projects using one of his fake companies, quietly sending money without anyone noticing. I stared at the images and, surprisingly, I didn't feel like crying. I smiled. Instead of despair, a strange calm filled me. I knew I had to be clever. I couldn't confront Graham or Tessa directly. That would ruin everything I was building. So, I created a new identity, Ellen Ward. It felt strange at first, pretending to be someone else, but I knew it was necessary. I had to understand Tessa and the role she played in Graham's secret life. I arranged to meet her at a design showcase in Chicago, keeping my alias and my intentions hidden. Tessa was charming and talkative, full of excitement about her career and, of course, Graham. She gushed about her boyfriend, saying he was planning to leave his wife and start over with her. I listened carefully, nodding and smiling politely, keeping my reactions in check. Every word she said was a piece of the puzzle I needed. I didn't reveal who I really was. Instead, I asked subtle questions and made small comments that planted seeds of doubt in her mind. I wanted her to start wondering, to second-guess what she thought she knew. Every expression she gave, every pause, every hesitant glance told me I was getting through to her without even saying a word directly. After the meeting, I walked away feeling a quiet satisfaction. Graham had underestimated me, and now I had a way to influence the situation without him realizing it. Tessa didn't know she was being observed, and Graham certainly didn't know that I was 10 steps ahead, carefully watching and planning. That night, I reviewed Mara's photos and my notes from the meeting. Each interaction, each subtle reaction, became part of a bigger strategy. I wasn't acting out of revenge yet. I was collecting information, understanding the players, and quietly preparing. Graham had thought he could control everything, but I was slowly turning the situation in my favor. I realized that knowing the truth gave me power. I wasn't helpless or trapped. I could see clearly the roles each person played in Graham's schemes, and I could act when the time was right. For now, patience was my ally. I would continue to observe, continue to gather evidence, and continue to lay the groundwork for the moment when I would finally take control. I went to bed that night with a sense of calm purpose. I wasn't just a wife deceived. I was someone who had learned the truth and was quietly planning the next moves. I had discovered the mistress, understood the finances behind her, and found a way to use that knowledge without exposing myself. For the first time, I felt entirely in control of the story Graham had tried to hide. About a month after discovering everything, Graham asked to sit down with me. He said he needed space to think, and suggested a trial separation. I nodded calmly, keeping my voice steady and composed. I let him believe I was upset and confused, that his idea had shaken me. Inside, I felt completely in control. I had already planned my next steps long before this moment. While Graham thought I was fragile, I quietly moved forward. Daniel finalized all my trust holdings and made sure my side of the finances was untouchable. He also froze the shared accounts, so Graham couldn't access any of the money he had been hiding or trying to move. Everything was done quietly, without raising suspicion. Graham had no idea that I had already prepared for this, that I was far ahead of him. I found a small rental to move into, a place that seemed ordinary enough to avoid drawing attention. I didn't want Graham to suspect that I was using this separation to gain control. To him, it looked like I was giving him freedom while I dealt with my emotions. But in reality, I was watching him, tracking his movements, and gathering evidence of every fraudulent transaction and concealed asset he thought he had hidden. Every day, I checked updates from Daniel and Mara, reviewing the patterns of his actions and the proof we had collected. I made detailed notes of everything. His calls, meetings, and trips, all carefully recorded. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I knew that the stronger my evidence, the more power I would have when the time came to confront him. During this separation, I stayed calm and measured. I didn't let Graham see any anger, any suspicion, or any hint that I had uncovered his secrets. He seemed to believe that he had outsmarted me, that he had control of the situation. Watching him walk around thinking he had freedom while I quietly collected proof felt oddly satisfying. I also used the time to plan my next moves. Each piece of information we gathered became part of a larger strategy. I wanted to ensure that nothing Graham did during this separation could damage me or the assets I was protecting. Every move I made was careful, deliberate, and calculated, keeping me always a step ahead. By the end of the month, I felt a quiet confidence. Graham thought he had manipulated the situation, but in truth, I was 5 steps ahead. My plan was almost complete, and soon I would have everything I needed to protect myself fully. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't vulnerable. I was ready, patient, and in complete control, letting him believe he had the upper hand while quietly securing everything he had tried to take. It was late on a Friday night when I saw Graham make his move. He initiated a wire transfer for the full $400 million, probably thinking no one would notice until it was too late. I watched quietly, knowing exactly what he was trying to do. But the transfer didn't go through. It bounced, and I could almost hear the panic building on his end. Weeks earlier, I had asked Daniel to file fraud alerts and identity theft reports under both of our names. Every precaution had been taken to make sure this moment would end in my favor. The bank, following proper protocol, immediately locked the account and started an audit. I had no doubt that they would uncover everything Graham had been trying to hide. Almost instantly, my phone started ringing. It was Graham, frantic and shouting, pretending that the bank had made some kind of mistake. He was begging, arguing, and trying to push blame anywhere but on himself. I kept my voice calm, careful to sound confused and concerned, as if I were just hearing about this chaos for the first time. Inside, I was calm. I knew the truth. Every transfer he had tried, every hidden account, every manipulation he had planned, none of it mattered anymore. The moment he thought he had total control, the plan collapsed in his hands. I watched him flail, powerless to fix what he had thought was foolproof. I listened carefully to every word, noting his tone, the desperation creeping into his voice, and the lies he was trying to spin. He had been so confident, so sure I didn't know. Now he was realizing that all his efforts had been useless. Every scheme, every hidden account, every attempt to siphon money was caught before he could use it. Even as he pleaded with me, I kept my act. I sounded sympathetic, confused, and worried, making him think he could still manipulate me. But I didn't need to intervene. The evidence, the alerts, and the bank's audit were all working perfectly on their own. I had created a situation where Graham was trapped by his own arrogance. Sitting back, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The panic in his voice, the desperation in his words, and the knowledge that he had been outsmarted made it clear that the game had shifted entirely. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing, letting the consequences unfold exactly as I had planned. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Graham had underestimated me, and his mistakes had become my advantage. He had tried to take control, to outmaneuver me, but now everything was crumbling around him. I knew that from this point forward, I held the power, and he could do nothing to stop what was coming next. I was sitting quietly in my rental when I heard a knock on the door that made my stomach tighten. Before I could even react, Graham barged in, his face red and eyes wild. He started shouting, accusing me of ruining everything, blaming me for problems I hadn't caused. He expected fear or panic from me, but I stayed calm, letting him vent while keeping my expression steady. I let him speak, letting his words fill the room, until he ran out of steam. Then, slowly, I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder I had prepared carefully over the past weeks. Inside were photos, emails, offshore records, and proof of his affair with Tessa. I set each piece on the table, one by one, spreading the evidence out so there was no hiding anything. At first, Graham just stared, and I could see the confidence draining from him. His voice, so loud and certain a moment ago, began to shake. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. I watched as the realization hit him. Everything he had tried to hide, everything he had believed was under his control, was now exposed and untouchable. I spoke clearly and calmly. I told him that I had already handed all of the evidence over to my attorney and the bank's fraud division. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't yell, and I didn't argue. I didn't have to. The silence that followed spoke louder than any words could. Graham's face fell as he realized that his schemes had failed and that I had been prepared for everything. He tried to interrupt, to protest, to shift blame, but I didn't respond. I simply waited, letting the weight of the evidence settle between us. For the first time, he couldn't control the conversation, couldn't manipulate the situation, couldn't convince me to bend to his will. I was calm, composed, and fully in charge of the room and the truth. Watching him falter was a strange feeling, part relief, part vindication. I had been planning for this confrontation carefully, making sure I had every piece of proof lined up and ready. Now, seeing the impact of my preparation made the weeks of careful work worth it. I could see the panic in his eyes, the moment he realized that all of his actions were now meaningless. By the time he left, the air in the room felt lighter. I wasn't shaken or upset, I was satisfied. I had taken control, and Graham had no power left to intimidate or deceive me. The confrontation was over, not with noise or drama, but with quiet authority and evidence that couldn't be denied. I knew then that I had completely turned the tables, and from this point on, I held all the cards. In the weeks after the confrontation, everything Graham had built started to fall apart. His firm suspended him immediately, and federal investigators froze his accounts. Every secret he had thought was safe was now exposed, and there was no way to hide from the consequences. The man who had believed he could control everything was losing it all in front of my eyes. Tessa, realizing she had been deceived and used, cooperated fully with the authorities. She provided statements and details about Graham's hidden finances and the gallery funding he had disguised through shell companies. Each revelation added another layer to the case against him, and the walls of his carefully constructed world began to crumble. Meanwhile, Graham's calls to me became constant and desperate. He begged, pleaded, and tried to convince me to settle privately, and let him save what little remained. He thought he could manipulate me with his words, but I stayed firm. I refused every plea, every attempt at persuasion. I knew that he had no right to any of it, and that I had already protected what was mine. I moved forward with the divorce on my own terms. I filed papers citing financial manipulation, concealed assets, and deliberate attempts to hide money from me. For the first time, I felt the weight of justice shifting in my favor. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was simply reclaiming what was rightfully mine and ensuring that he could not take advantage of me again. As the story broke in the financial press, Graham's reputation collapsed almost overnight. Articles detailed his secret accounts, his illegal transfers, and his manipulation of both his wife and business partners. The man who had thought he could outsmart everyone became a cautionary tale, a warning to anyone who believed they could act without consequence. His world of power and influence was gone, replaced by public shame and legal scrutiny. I watched it all unfold quietly, knowing I had planned everything carefully and stayed ahead at every step. There was no satisfaction in seeing him fall in a personal sense. This was about justice and security. I had protected myself, exposed the truth, and made sure that the law was on my side. By the end of it, Graham was a shadow of the man I had once known. Calls stopped, meetings ceased, and even Tessa, despite her own betrayal, had moved on. The collapse was complete, and I felt a sense of calm authority. I hadn't been reckless or emotional. I had stayed precise, deliberate, and focused from the very beginning, and it had paid off completely. I finally realized that everything he had tried to take from me, money, power, and control, was now out of his hands. The empire he had built in secret had fallen, and I had survived it intact, prepared, and stronger than ever. The divorce was finally over, and I felt a quiet sense of relief. Everything was settled on my terms. My assets were secure, and my dignity remained intact. For the first time in months, I could take a deep breath and truly feel free. Graham had lost everything he had tried to hide, and I had reclaimed my life without compromising who I was. I decided to leave the city behind and move to a small coastal town in Maine. The air was fresh, the ocean calming, and the pace slower. It was the perfect place to start over, to create a life built on my own terms rather than being tied to someone else's deception. I found a small, cozy house with a porch that overlooked the water. Standing there, I could feel the weight of the past lifting. But I didn't want my experience to be wasted. I had learned so much about protecting myself, about staying vigilant and smart when finances and trust were at stake. I quietly started a foundation to help women going through divorce safeguard their money and navigate tricky financial situations. It wasn't public or flashy. It was discreet, careful, and practical. My goal was to give others the knowledge and confidence I had gained the hard way. The foundation became a new focus for me, and I poured energy into it with a sense of purpose. I didn't dwell on anger or revenge. I had learned that calm strategy and clear thinking were far more powerful than emotion. My life now had direction, and I felt a quiet, steady strength that I hadn't known before. One afternoon, as I signed the final legal document transferring Graham's seized assets to restitution, I whispered to myself. He thought I was behind him. I was always ahead. The words felt right. They captured everything I had endured and everything I had accomplished. I had stayed patient, clever, and firm, and now the results were real. After finishing the paperwork, I stepped onto my porch and looked out at the ocean. The tide rolled in, steady and unchanging, and I felt a deep sense of calm. The horizon was wide and open, full of possibilities. I realized that I wasn't just free from Graham or the chaos he had caused. I was free in a much deeper sense. I had control over my life, my decisions, and my future. Standing there, listening to the waves and feeling the breeze, I understood something essential. Power didn't have to be loud or aggressive. True strength was quiet, composed, and deliberate. I had faced betrayal, deception, and greed, and I had come out stronger, wiser, and completely in command of my life. The freedom I felt was complete, and I knew I would never let anyone take it from me again.